Hey guys, welcome to my channel where we talk about writing and books and reading and editing and publishing and all that jazz. Children may or may not be featured. Enjoy! Hey everyone, as many of you know, I went to a writing conference over the weekend and it was awesome. I was kind of skeptical. I didn't know much about it. It was basically a conference for creatives who are also Christian. And I was like, either this is going to be awesome or it's going to be the worst waste of time. And it turned out to be awesome. So I wanted to share what I learned so you guys can kind of learn what I learned without having to pay and go yourselves. First off, the venue was absolutely gorgeous. So you may be familiar with this or not, but it was held at the Glen Erie Castle. And it's down in Colorado Springs. But just imagine basically like the Beauty and the Beast castle shrunk down a little bit in the mountains. It was so beautiful. Just the grounds are like so beautifully taken care of, and it's an old castle that's been preserved, and I just got to be in it all weekend. It was so cool. I felt like a princess. And there was a ton of wildlife in the Glen Erie Resort. There were mountain goats and bighorn sheep in herds, just running across the grass where people where you walk. And then there was also wild turkeys everywhere, big ones too. So that was kind of cool. There was actually this one time where a whole herd of bighorn sheep came running off the mountain and galloping across the grounds, and I was like, am I in a dream right now? There's a herd of wild animals going across the green rolling hills with a castle next to me, and I'm like. But as much as the venue was awesome, the actual conference was even more cool. Like I said before, I was really skeptical. I didn't really have high expectations. My old teachers from Lutheran had invited me, and I was like, sure, I guess. I get to spend time with you guys. Haven't seen you in forever, so I'll go with you. So they got me to sign up. And I am so glad I went. The conference was called Imagination Redeemed, and it was basically just a bunch of creatives that are also Jesus followers, and they all gathered together to kind of discuss how we can redeem our imaginations. And one thing that I just absolutely loved about it was the fact that it wasn't just writers, or it wasn't just artists. There were fine artists, there were novelists, there were poets, and there were also musicians and vocalists. So basically all kind of fine art and creativity mixed together. And it was really cool because I took a few classes because they had breakout sessions by writers, because I thought I could learn a lot from them, and I did. But I actually ended up learning more from musicians and songwriters and artists, because they're so experienced in a different way of being creative, and it really gave me a wider perspective on how to tell stories better. My favorite class of all was actually taught by a musician, and his name is Matthew Clark. You should go look him up on Spotify. He is so awesome. I love his music. But he talked about feasting, and on the surface that seemed like kind of a weird subject, but I was like, I guess I'll go to it. I don't know, we'll just see what it's like. And he just talked about how as Christians we can feast and celebrate, and art and writing and storytelling being a part of that celebration, because we have the hope of heaven. I've often struggled with the fact that writing stories isn't super practical. In a world where so much is needed, there's so much suffering, there's so many issues, it seems kind of like a waste of time to tell stories or write songs or make art when that doesn't really have a practical use. And he kind of explained that as Christians we are allowed and even called to celebrate because we know that there is hope. Another thing I learned at the conference, or more was reminded of, was just the power of the gospel. I think as writers and creatives, we have this pressure to be original and to make something that has never been written before or people have never heard of. And that's true, it's really good to be original, but the problem is it's impossible to do. And I knew that, but I had just kind of forgotten how powerful the gospel is in any story and how those themes ring true in the heart of every single one of my readers, whether they're a Christian or not. I mean, if you notice, think of just the greatest movies that you love, the classics, or some of your favorite books. I guarantee you most of them have self-sacrifice somewhere in them, because that narrative just like hits our hearts so hard. And that's because the story of the gospel is like the answer. So I was just reminded of that. I actually wrote down a ton of story ideas just from being there, because I was like, oh my gosh, that would make a great story. I'll share one with you right now. So I talked about the fact that I'm writing a new book in my last video, and you can watch that if you want, if you haven't yet. But one of the stories I wanted to include in it was something that just hit me over the weekend. And I was thinking about the story of Abraham and Isaac, and how, I mean, you know the story. Abraham takes his son up to the mountain. He's his only son. Abraham can't really have children because he's so old. And God calls him to basically sacrifice his son on the mountain. And Abraham is like, oh gosh, like, he doesn't want to do it. But he leads his son to the mountain top and says, God will provide. He ties his son to the altar. Poor Isaac, he's probably freaking out at this point. And raises the sword above his head to sacrifice him. And at that moment, a sheep appears tangled in a bush because God provided the sacrifice. And I love that story, but I realized that while Father Abraham didn't have to sacrifice his only son that day, hundreds of years later, a different father had to sacrifice his only son, and nothing stopped him from killing him this time. And that contrast, like, opened my eyes to the gospel even more. So I ended up including that in my new book, which was kind of cool. Another thing I wanted to talk with you guys about was just the logistics, like the price and the hotel and stuff, in case you wanted to go. So the price for the conference by itself was, I think, $170. Sorry, it's like super windy out here. But I consider it like completely worth it, because they included a meal in there, and it was like a full Saturday and a Friday night, so it was like a day and a half, and I learned so much from it. So I thought that was worth it. For the hotel, we didn't stay at Glen Erie Castle because it was crazy expensive. So we went to a hotel that was close by, and they weren't too expensive. They were just like really full that day. So I would just make sure you call ahead if you're gonna try to get a hotel. It was super weird. They had like the 10 Commandments on like a gigantic pillar on the front, but like nothing about the hotel was Christian except for that. It was just weird. I don't know what was going on there, but I'm alive, so all that's to say is it was an awesome conference. I'd highly suggest it to anybody who's interested in being a writer, being a songwriter, being a musician or a vocalist, a poet, even an artist. Like, you can learn so much about your craft going there, and storytelling applies to every single one of those fields. So it's well worth your time. This is not me endorsing them or anything. Like, I just had a good time. Last thing I learned about the weekend was it is so important to surround yourself with other Christian creatives. I mean, obviously you can learn a lot from secular artists and secular creatives, but when you're united by the gospel and your motives, it is so powerful. I asked a bunch of questions to a lot of people who are more talented and more successful than I am, and all of them had their hearts just angled towards growing God's kingdom. And to me, that motive is so much higher and so much better than making money or getting famous or anything like that. Um, so I just felt so full after being in their presence and learning from them. Because it's easy as a creative to kind of slip into the mindset that you have to be famous or build your own empire or, I don't know, just get successful, work your butt off for all this stuff. But when you're grounded in the gospel and you're reminded that the only reason we're doing this is because God loves us and we want to share his love with other people, when you're reminded of that, it is so powerful. So anyway, that was my experience with the Imagination Redeemed conference. I'll probably go back next year if I can afford it. And I hope you guys learned from what I learned, because I learned a ton. Well, thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you next week.